Welcome to this week's edition of Chatting the Pictures. Michael, this week we are back for the second of our year in review episodes. For this episode, we've chosen 3 photographs that highlight the outstanding work being produced by the many amazing women photojournalists who are currently out there working today. Our first segment we call The News. This segment asks how news photos tell a story.
This photo was taken by Anna Moneymaker for the New York Times on September 27, 2019 on Capitol Hill. The photograph documents a meeting between freshman Democratic Congresswomen from moderate districts, all with military or national security experience, and all initially neutral on the impeachment push. The meeting culminated in their decision to sign on to the impeachment effort. The Congresswomen concluded that America's election security was at stake, and this decision among the group tipped the balance for Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats to move forward with impeachment. Pictured in the photograph are Abigail Spanberger of Virginia, Mickey Sherrill of New Jersey, Chrissy Holohan of Pennsylvania, and Alyssa Slotkin of Michigan.
This is a group of lawmakers sitting in a circle, and they appear to be deliberating and listening very intently to one another. Just that alone, I think, really defies the stereotype of a combative Congress and also really highlights the gravity of the conversation they were having. Does not appear to be a table of lawmakers trying to decide how best to spin an issue. They appear to be thoughtful, engaged, and again, they're listening to one another. That suggests the seriousness of this issue.
When I saw this photograph, it jumped out at me, especially in the next couple of days when Congress people will have to actually cast an impeachment vote. This photograph becomes even more important.
The photo is also marking the fact that the crucial lawmakers in tipping this decision are not only freshmen, but they're freshman women. So we had a very large number, right? 64 Democrats joined the new Congress. Much was made of the so-called squad, the more liberal wing of that group of freshman Congresswomen. And what you have here is another group of women lawmakers, also new to Congress, exploring and engaging the same issue. And they're doing it essentially in the halls, in the rooms of a place that has been very exclusively male for a very long time. And so to me, it's the sitting in a circle, collaborative listening, deliberating moment in that space that's very executive, very dark paneled wood, very masculine. That's this really interesting juxtaposition. And when you add on top of that, that certain of these freshman Congresswomen have intelligence backgrounds, military backgrounds that we would cast as more traditionally male, it becomes a really interesting picture, literally, of what governance looks like behind the scenes.
We really have lost that sense of basic communication in our politics. Forget about like the hyper-partisanship out there, the bullying, the mansplaining, the racial, ethnic, and gender discrimination. Just like you said, the fact that these women are sitting down, they're listening, those different facial expressions indicate people are processing in very personal and distinct ways.
One of the things I really think is interesting about this photograph is that it is not illustrating a story about women in Congress. Often when you see a group of women in Congress, it's, oh, look at all of these women in Congress, right? That's the story. The implicit nature of that, because again, this is not a group of Congresswomen sitting around to talk about their experiences as women in Congress. They are doing the work of being a lawmaker. Our next segment we call The Look, and here we are interested in how photos push the visual boundaries to illuminate a story or idea.
This photo was taken by Khulud Eid for the New York Times. It's for a story about child sexual abuse and digital media. When they were 7 and 11 years old, these 2 Midwestern sisters were sexually abused by their father. They are identified only as F, the younger sister, on the left, and E on the right. According to the New York Times article, many pictures and videos of them are on the internet still, including one with the younger sister F, who was drugged and raped by her father and another man.
This photo is an answer to the question of how do you sensitively and ethically photograph women who have not only been sexually abused, but for whom photography itself was an instrument of that abuse. We've seen these stories we're going to continue to see these stories, and their story is a particularly terrible and traumatic example of this. If you're the photographer, you have to be very thoughtful about how you are going to photograph these two young women who are very bravely sharing their experiences. They are anonymous, and that's one of the reasons why the images that I shot do not show their faces.
In spite of it, and maybe because of it, the photograph is extraordinarily expressive. It makes me think that perhaps in portraits, faces can be overrated. You don't need a face to communicate or reveal as much as this photograph does.
And so when you don't have the face, what are the other ways that you tell a very personal story, and how do you visualize that? The story that is communicated to me by this image is, first of all, the photographer does an incredible job of establishing these sisters in relationship. So they are clearly bonded together, not only through what we know they went through together, but through the images themselves. So that you see their very close, intimate connection with one another. And as you said, that protectiveness. And then the second thing I think is that the photos also do a really nice job of visualizing their youth. These women are still very young. That I think is communicated in a number of ways, largely through their clothing, what they're wearing, their jewelry, their choice of hair color. You get the impression that not only were these women young children when this initially happened to them, but they're still very young people who are going to have to deal with this trauma for the rest of their lives. And to me, that's a really powerful component of this image as well.
And what's really mind-blowing to me is how much is communicated through both the composition and the setting. The verticality of the photograph, I think, has a lot to say, where you see more sky than land. Whatever happened on the ground for these two women, the trauma that they experienced, you see them at this point breaking through to the sky. So it brings up metaphors of standing tall, rising up, holding up. And then in terms of the setting, clearly gives you a Midwestern setting, but the house is a blur. So what it says to you also is that they're kind of putting that earthly trauma, the events that happen inside, behind them. And in fact, the embrace then, as a counterpoint, shows the two sisters as creating their own shelter.
I thought a lot about the photographer's choice to photograph the women outdoors. And I thought a lot about how else would you photograph people in this situation. And I thought, you could shoot them in black and white, and maybe their hand would cover their face to protect their anonymity, and it would be indoors and dark. And immediately you know that those kinds of images for this story are just the wrong choice. Bad things happen to these women in private. And so to photograph them outside, to photograph them in a context where literally they are exposing to the daylight what happened to them, I think is a really important thing, and a really, really wise and quite ethical choice on the part of the photographer. Our last segment we call the pick, and here we are interested in what makes a photo a good editorial choice when there are lots of options.
This photograph was taken by Pilar Olivares for Reuters, and it shows a demonstrator taking cover behind a makeshift shield during a protest in Santiago in November. The Chilean protest started in October over a hike in public transportation fares. It's just one of the leaderless mass protests that we're seeing around the world right now in countries from South America to the Mideast, with the public rising up over crime, corruption, and human rights abuses. And in fact, what makes the photograph very important, I believe, is the role of the water cannon. I think what the photograph is doing, as much as anything, is bringing attention to what's now being called less lethal weapon abuse, or LLW, for crowd control. And this is focused particularly on water cannons and the use of tear gas. Human rights organizations are moving to classify these techniques as a form of torture.
That notion of the water cannon taking on a primary space as ways to hold back protesters reminded me of the very famous photographs by the photojournalist Charles Moore, who shot in the United States during the Civil Rights era and in Birmingham in 1963, when the city essentially turned water hoses directly on nonviolent protesters working with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Moore's photographs very vividly illustrated the power of water and the physical assault that those sorts of powerful streams of water can produce. In particular, there's an image of Moors where firefighters are working together to control a single stream of water at the backs of protesters who are sitting on the ground. This image showing a person essentially defending themselves against that kind of stream of water with the makeshift shield really suggests, again, the power of that form of so-called crowd control.
Another thing that struck me, and maybe it's me being a fan of South American literature, or maybe it's just the Cultural and Cinematic Association, but I can't stop looking at that cape. It makes me think about resistance in these days and times as being a superpower.
And the fact that the red pops out as one of the very few examples of bright color in this image, I think really hits that home. Also, the power of the water, right? The fact that that cape is blowing in the wind of whatever that guy is facing, I think further highlights what the protesters were essentially defending themselves against.
What's happening in these countries around the world right now are people really channeling superpower to rise up. And you can see that both in the cape and also in the kind of gladiatorial reference of these shields.
And then, as you often have in images from these protest events, you have the crowd behind seeming to either not notice what's going on or to be kind of standing around or not paying attention. Like there's this kind of vagueness that I think often accompanies photojournalistic images of these protest events and spectacles where the effects of the action and the impact of the action isn't quite felt in the same way. I can imagine someone reading this image and thinking, oh, well, these protests must have been very small and no one seems to be paying much attention. But of course, when you look at all the other images, when you see actually what's been going on, millions and millions of people have been very actively protesting for months now. But there is that ambivalence of protest photography can sometimes communicate multiple things within the same frame. And I'm thinking too about just the differences between this image in an urban area and some of the images we've seen recently from Hong Kong. Here we've gotten, I feel like, more of the action on the ground, whereas the Hong Kong imagery is often much more about backed way off, showing the size of the crowd. You get these kind of two different points of view on conflicts that are about different things, but that are both gathering people in urban public spaces for citizens to make their voices heard. Thanks for joining us for this special year-end episode.
You can find us on readingthepictures.org. You can find us on Twitter at readingthepics and on Instagram at readingthepictures.
We will see you in 2020.
Take care.